The Baltic Sea air, thick with the brine and cold diesel exhaust of trawlers, pressed down on the dockyard. It was 0300 hours, and a fog the color of old cement was rolling in from the open water, a blessing for the men on the pier, but a curse for the Soviet border guards on duty in their squat, concrete watchtower a kilometer away. Below the tower, the steel net of the Baltic Fleet's P-3 radar pulsed silently, a massive, invisible web designed to detect anything larger than a rowing boat trying to slip out of the Soviet sphere and into NATO waters. It was a net built to stop attack, not escape. A man moved in the deep shadow cast by a retired fishing vessel, the Krasny Oktyabr. He was Sergei, a mechanic at the local shipyard, a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom. Sergei was 32, his hands permanently stained with grease and oil, the uniform of a man who knew how to make metal move. He wasn't military. His uniform was worn overalls, a thick woolen telniashka undershirt, and a pair of heavily patched fisherman's boots. In the back of a battered, three-wheeled cargo cart, the kind used to haul spare parts between sheds, he was transporting his dream. It was a nightmare of salvaged metal, a cylindrical hull about 4.5 meters long, constructed mostly from 3 thick-walled boiler tubes welded end-to-end. This wasn't a sleek, military-grade machine, it was a patchwork contraption of necessity, a testament to what a desperate man could build with access to a scrapyard and a welder. He called it the Piranha, a private joke at the expense of the huge, slow Soviet naval leviathans. Sergei paused, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a naval patrol boat, the Project 122 bis subchaser, moving past the main breakwater. He knew the routine, the exact patrol pattern. They would pass, turn, and be out of sight for precisely 23 minutes and 42 seconds. That was his window. He unlatched the back of the cart, the heavy, metallic clank muted by the fog. The submarine was resting on 2 thick wooden rollers. Sergei braced his shoulder against the stern, his muscles straining. The Piranha weighed nearly 2.5 tons, a dead weight of steel, ballast tanks made from scavenged oxygen cylinders, and a tiny, 8-horsepower diesel engine lifted from an old power generator. He pushed. The rollers squeaked, a sound like a small, distressed animal in the silence. Sergei froze, his eyes locked on the faint, distant yellow glow of the watchtower. No change. The sentry, probably drinking weak tea and watching the cold radar screen, hadn't noticed. Inch by excruciating inch, the homemade craft moved toward the water. The dockside here was steep, used for launching smaller repair barges. A slick of algae and spilled oil made the final meters treacherous. Sergei wedged a heavy wooden block under one roller and checked his payload. Inside the tiny cockpit, a space barely large enough to sit with knees bent to his chest, were his provisions, a single loaf of black bread, a block of salo, cured pork fat, 3 thermos flasks of water, and a single, dog-eared copy of Konstantin Postovsky's The Story of the Woods, a favorite from his youth. The only instrument was a salvaged magnetic compass mounted precariously on the pressure hull and an oil pressure gauge for the engine. Navigation would be by dead reckoning and pure, stubborn hope. The hull reached the edge, the front roller tipping into the void. The sound of displacement, a deep, heavy splash, echoed unervingly in the fog. But the surrounding dock sheds, high and cavernous, trapped the sound, absorbing it. The Piranha floated lower than he'd calculated, the waterline rising dangerously close to the seams where the old boiler sections met. The welds, done over 3 agonizing months in a secluded corner of the repair yard, held. They had to. Sergei quickly secured the cart and then, with an economy of movement born of practice, climbed aboard the hull. He unbolted the makeshift hatch, a thick, circular steel plate from a retired ship's ventilator, secured by 6 heavy wing nuts. He lowered himself into the cramped, oil-smelling interior. Inside, the air was immediately thick and cold. He was essentially sitting inside a metal cylinder, his face mere inches from the array of pipes, wires, and makeshift gauges. He had to assume the air was already stale, and his small, hand-operated carbon dioxide scrubber, a box of powdered lime, was a weak insurance policy against asphyxiation. The wingnuts were tightened, the steel plate groaning into place. The final, absolute click of the last nut was the sound of the door slamming on his old life. He was alone, sealed in a vessel built by a man desperate for freedom. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the damp, recycled air. The next sound was the rasp of the diesel starter cord being pulled. The small, salvaged engine coughed once, hesitated, and then roared to life with a vibrating, metallic clatter that felt deafening inside the hull. He was moving, and the invisible Soviet border guards were still 23 minutes away from returning. The escape was on. The noise, trapped and amplified within the steel cylinder, was Sergei's biggest fear. On the surface, the diesel engine sounded like a particularly persistent lawnmower, a sound that, even in the dense fog, could carry hundreds of meters across the still harbor water. He eased the engine into its lowest gear, a low thrumming that shook the makeshift control panel. The Piranha began to move, its bow cutting a sluggish V through the oily water, heading away from the pier and toward the main channel markers. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Every nerve ending strained for the returning roar of the Project 122 subchaser. He had to get under. Surface travel was a suicide run. He reached for the handwheel that controlled the ballast system, a series of heavy brass valves regulating the flow of seawater into the repurposed oxygen cylinders bolted to the keel. The maneuver was slow and terrifyingly uncontrolled. The valve handle was stiff, resisting his desperate turns. Water rushed in with a fierce, gurgling roar, instantly increasing the metallic tang of the air inside the cabin. The Piranha listed violently to port, then righted itself sluggishly. Sergei fought the primitive controls, watching the crude depth gauge, a simple, sealed glass tube containing mercury, begin its agonizingly slow descent. 3 meters. 4 meters. The engine noise changed, becoming muffled, a deeper, less distinct pulse. The only illumination came from a single, oil-fed lantern, its weak yellow light throwing long, unsettling shadows across the exposed pipes. The water outside the thick perspex viewport, salvaged from a tractor cabin and painstakingly sealed, was an opaque, churning green-black. At 7 meters, the sub finally stabilized. The external clatter vanished, replaced by the isolating hiss of the water slipping past the hull and the steady, reassuring thump-thump-thump of the engine vibrating through the steel. He was finally invisible. Just as the silence settled, a new sound began to filter through the hull, a distant, powerful, and growing shhhh boom, shhhh boom. It was the patrol boat. It had rounded the breakwater and was accelerating, returning to its regular beat. Sergei instantly killed his engine. He was now 7 meters down, adrift, and perfectly silent. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the gentle, almost imperceptible creak of the hull adapting to the pressure. The subchaser, a gray phantom, passed directly over him. The shhhh boom became a deafening, grinding cacophony transmitted directly through the water and into his steel coffin. The entire submarine shook. A small leak, a drop the size of a kopeck, sprang from a forgotten seam near the rudder controls, dripping onto the oil-soaked floorboards. He held his breath, paralyzed not by fear of drowning, but by the fear of detection. These boats were equipped with primitive hydrophones and sonar. Even a faint change in the water density, a bubble of escaping air, or the smallest rotation of his propeller shaft could give him away. The vibrations faded. The shhhh boom receded, slowly dissolving into the deep silence of the Baltic. Sergei counted slowly to 564, the precise length of the patrol's absence. He had held on for too long. His lungs burned. He fumbled for the starter cord and, pulling it with a renewed surge of adrenaline, brought the little diesel back to life. It caught instantly. He checked his course on the magnetic compass. Due west. Straight toward the open sea. He didn't dare try to steer any deeper. The hull's construction was a total unknown at increased pressures, and he was already pushing the limits of the boiler tube's integrity. 7 meters would have to be enough. The next hours were a grueling monotony of noise, oil fumes, and constant, debilitating cold. The engine noise was ceaseless. The diesel fumes, meant to be vented by a crude snort system, a pipe sticking up from the hull with a float valve, were instead pooling inside the cramped space, making his head ache and his eyes water. He had to keep the snort pipe relatively close to the surface, maintaining a depth of between 7 and 10 meters. This was the dangerous cruising band, deep enough to avoid visual detection, but shallow enough to remain within the operational envelope of the P-3 radar surface wave sweep and the occasional border guard helicopter overhead. He navigated entirely by sound and feel. The constant vibration became a second heartbeat. The small, salvaged propeller turned tirelessly, driving the Piranha forward at a maximum speed he estimated at just over 3 knots. He calculated the distance to the edge of the Soviet territorial waters, approximately 180 kilometers. A journey of at least 32 hours, submerged, in a vessel designed for a mechanic's scrap heap, not an ocean crossing. He was now past the harbor buoys, into the open, turbulent swell of the Baltic. The tiny sub pitched and rolled violently, throwing him against the cold, sweating walls of the pressure hull. His stomach rebelled. He clamped his jaw shut, forcing down the nausea. He had to maintain consciousness. He was deep into the Soviet maritime exclusion zone, the most heavily monitored stretch of water on the entire Baltic coast. Ahead, not visible through the murky water, lay the real barrier, a shifting field of acoustic listening posts and deep-sea anti-submarine nets installed to prevent NATO infiltrators. He had to cross this invisible minefield of sensors, trusting his tiny, insignificant vessel would be perceived as nothing more than a lost school of fish, or simply ignored. He reached for the black bread, tearing off a piece with his free hand. He needed the energy. As he chewed the stale crust, the compass needle, usually steady, began to swing wildly. Not a mechanical fault. It meant he was passing through an area of intense magnetic interference. It could only be one thing, a massive military presence, likely a submerged Soviet submarine or a heavily shielded surface destroyer. He instantly cut the engine again, sinking the Piranha deeper, praying that the magnetic footprint of his homemade junk was too small to register on their sophisticated sensors. The silent descent, driven by gravity and the small amount of remaining water in his trim tanks, was agonizingly slow. The depth gauge edged past 10 meters, then 12. At this depth, the pressure on the salvaged hull was immense. Sergei could hear the microscopic sounds of stress, faint, high-pitched pings and creaks that sounded like tiny stones cracking under a hammer. He knew he was gambling with the structural integrity of the old boiler tubes. A weld seam failing now meant instant, catastrophic flooding. The magnetic anomaly was directly above him. He didn't need sonar to identify it. The crushing weight of the water was punctuated by a new, lower-frequency sound, a heavy, cyclical whoomp-whoomp-whoomp that vibrated deep in his chest cavity. It was the propeller cavitation of a large, Soviet naval vessel, likely a Project 61 destroyer, Kashin class, a powerful anti-submarine warfare platform. The ship was patrolling slowly, methodically, probably unaware of the tiny, silent lump of scrap iron directly beneath its keel. Sergei held his breath until his vision started to tunnel. He focused on the magnetic compass, which was now spinning like a deranged top, the influence of the massive steel hull overhead completely overwhelming the Earth's magnetic field. He was blind and deaf, relying purely on the hope that his Piranha was simply too small and too primitive to trip the sophisticated detection arrays of a modern warship. Then, the destroyer's systems came alive. A sound like a massive, metallic chime, a piercing, high-frequency ping, stabbed through the water. It was active sonar, broadcasting a pulse designed to bounce off any solid object in the water column. The first ping hit the Piranha like a physical shockwave. The small vessel hummed and resonated under the impact. Sergei instinctively ducked his head, though there was no protection from sound. Ping. A second pulse, closer, sharper. He had to move, but moving meant running his engine, which meant certain detection. He had to trust that the low target strength, TS, of his sub, the measure of how much sonar energy it reflected, was below the destroyer's automatic threshold. A professional submarine was designed with a highly curved, smooth hull to deflect these pulses. The Piranha was a jagged cylinder of thick, reflective steel. He focused on the hydroplanes, small fins on the stern, controlled by a bicycle chain-driven linkage, and subtly changed the angle of attack. He was attempting to use the water current, the slow, underwater drift, to push him out of the immediate danger zone. The effect was negligible. The whoomp-whoomp of the destroyer's propellers was stationary, meaning the ship was hovering, actively pinging the area. Ping. 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 The sonar pings were becoming faster, more insistent. They were sweeping the area, refining their focus. It was possible they hadn't found an exact target, but had merely picked up an ambiguous contact of interest, a pressure anomaly or a slight current disturbance. Sergei was fighting a massive ship commanded by a highly trained crew, and his only weapon was the obscurity of his own failure to look like a threat. He waited for the next sound, the high-pitched shriek of an anti-submarine torpedo being launched, or the deep splash of a depth charge being dropped. Neither came. The pings suddenly ceased. The profound, overwhelming silence of the deep returned, broken only by the distant, receding whoomp-whoomp-whoomp. The destroyer was moving away. It had dismissed the contact. It had decided that the strange reflection was a bubble of gas, a large rock formation, or simply a fault in the sensor readings. Exhaustion hit Sergei in a paralyzing wave. He slumped against the metal hull, the cold steel conducting the water temperature right through his overalls. He reached up and slowly, carefully, reopened the fuel line and pulled the starter cord. The 8-horsepower diesel caught instantly, the engine noise now sounding unbelievably loud and raw after the hours of silence. He eased the Piranha up to 10 meters, then began the slow, torturous push westward again. He was deep inside the network of acoustic sensors now. He began to realize the sheer impossibility of his task. It wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one. Every unexpected sound, a large fish scraping the hull, a shift in ballast, the change in the engine's note, was amplified into a potential death sentence. Hours passed, marked only by the consumption of his dwindling water supply and the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the compass bearing as he compensated for the drift. He was suffering from extreme oxygen deprivation and carbon dioxide buildup. His movements were becoming sluggish, his thoughts slow and fuzzy. He knew he had to reach up to the stern and crank the hand-powered CO2 scrubber, a punishing physical task, but his body resisted. Finally, he forced himself to move. The exertion was dizzying. As he worked the crank, sweat poured from his face, only to be instantly chilled by the damp air. When he was done, he checked the viewport. The water was no longer the muddy brown-green of the coastal shelf. It was a deep, crystalline blue. He was in the deep water basin of the Baltic, meaning he had passed the immediate coastal patrols. The danger was still immense, but the character of the challenge had changed. The naval patrols were less dense, but any contacts he made now would be faster, more aggressive, and likely less forgiving. He was 20 hours into his voyage. He was halfway to Gotland Island, Sweden. The shift in water color to a deep, crystalline blue was the first sign of progress, a tiny flicker of light in the unending darkness of the hull. But the deep water brought its own cruelties. The Baltic Sea in August, even far from the coast, maintained a bone-chilling temperature. The steel hull of the Piranha was a brutally efficient conductor, leaching every calorie of warmth from Sergei's body. He was suffering from the creeping onset of hypothermia, his teeth chattering uncontrollably despite the heavy overalls. The primary enemy now was the mechanical failure. The tiny, salvaged 8-horsepower diesel engine, designed for short bursts of power in a stationary generator, was screaming in protest. It had been running almost continuously for 21 hours, submerged, sucking in air through the precarious snorkel pipe. The oil pressure gauge, a rusty antique, was fluttering dangerously low. The engine was overheating, its metallic protest becoming a sharper, higher-pitched whine that signaled imminent seizure. Sergei knew he couldn't stop. To surface was to risk instant detection by Soviet border patrol aircraft or surface vessels that periodically traversed these international waters. To stop the engine meant going adrift, losing all directional control, and risking being pushed back by the current into the deep, sensor-laden military zone he had just escaped. He opened a small service panel near the engine block, releasing a suffocating wave of hot, oily steam and exhaust fumes into the already poisoned cabin air. He could feel the heat radiating off the block. Desperate, he found the tube he had jury-rigged for emergency cooling, a small siphon designed to draw in external seawater. He knew this was a massive risk. Drawing water directly into the engine compartment meant weakening the hull seal, but he had no choice. He cracked the valve. A fierce jet of frigid, high-pressure seawater immediately shot across the engine block, vaporizing instantly into a blinding, scalding cloud of steam. The temperature gauge dropped, sharply and suddenly. The engine whined in relief, its metallic scream settling back into a hard, rhythmic thrum. Sergei had bought himself time, but he had also introduced a steady, slow seepage of salt water onto the electric wiring of the starter motor. The sheer loneliness was an environmental factor now, as corrosive as the salt water. The only companionship was the rhythmic noise of the machinery and the claustrophobic presence of the water pressing on the viewport. He tried to think of his destination, Sweden, a neutral, free country. He pictured it not as a political ideal, but as a simple, tangible goal, a warm beach, dry land, and a world where he could build a new boat that didn't constantly threaten to kill him. He looked at the magnetic compass, its needle now steady, pointing stubbornly west. He calculated his remaining distance based on his average speed of 3 knots, an optimistic estimate given the engine stress and the heavy currents. He had another 12 to 15 hours of continuous running to reach the safety of Swedish territorial waters. He glanced at his provisions. The loaf of black bread was now dry and hard. He chewed a small piece of salo, the greasy, high-calorie pork fat momentarily flooding his system with warmth, a deceptive sensation in the cold. He had to ration the water. Suddenly, the monotonous noise was interrupted. Not by sonar, but by a catastrophic clunk from the stern. The entire sub shuddered violently, and the Piranha's nose dipped sharply. The engine note changed, revving high and fast, but the vessel was slowing dramatically. The small, salvaged propeller shaft was either fouled or had suffered a structural failure. Sergei immediately cut the engine. The resulting silence was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. He was adrift, dead in the water, somewhere in the middle of the Baltic's busiest shipping lane, directly in the path of potential Soviet and international traffic. The darkness outside the viewport was complete, a blackness intensified by the knowledge that he was completely helpless. He had to exit the hull to assess the damage. This was the moment he had dreaded, leaving the safety of the pressure vessel. He had prepared for this, bolting a small scuba tank and a primitive regulator, an army surplus piece, to the ceiling of the cabin. Putting on the gear was awkward in the cramped space. He wrestled with the heavy tank, the steel pressing against the glass viewport. He had to be quick. The cold would kill him rapidly outside the hull. He reached for the hatch wing nuts, his chilled fingers fumbling. Slowly, painstakingly, he loosened the 6 heavy fasteners. As the last nut came free, the pressure difference, 10 meters of water bearing down on the small area of the hatch, caused the seal to break with a sharp, explosive hiss. Water immediately began to jet into the cabin, a thin but powerful stream of freezing liquid. Sergei braced his shoulders against the hatch cover, fighting the incredible pressure, and pushed. With a violent, grinding resistance, the circular plate cracked open enough for him to squeeze out. The frigid water instantly enveloped him, a shock that stole his breath. He was outside, clinging to the hull of his submersible, exposed, silent, and deeply submerged in the black heart of the Baltic Sea. He used the limited light from his waterproof flashlight, a scavenged Soviet Navy diver's lamp, to check the propeller. What he saw confirmed his fears. A heavy fishing net, dragged off the bottom by the currents, was hopelessly snarled around the propeller and the rudder assembly. The fishing vessel that had lost it was long gone, but the ghost of its activity now held the Piranha hostage, a net trap waiting for the Soviet patrols to discover him. He had to cut it free, and he had to do it now, before his air ran out. The cold was an immediate, stunning violence. Sergei's hands, protected only by thin mechanic's gloves, were losing sensation within seconds. He clung to the smooth, algae-slicked stern of the Piranha, the limited beam of his diving lamp cutting a cone of shaky yellow light into the absolute blackness of the deep Baltic water. The depth was still only 10 meters, but the pressure and the silence amplified the sense of profound isolation. The net was a heavy, industrial-grade tangle of thick, synthetic polyethylene rope, designed to withstand the thrashing of tons of fish. It was wrapped tightly around the small, two-bladed propeller shaft, the thickest part of the net cinching against the rudder linkage, rendering the entire aft section useless. He had brought a tool for this exact contingency, a heavy-duty, curved marline spike and a serrated diving knife, a standard issue from the shipyard's small equipment locker. But working underwater at 10 meters, fighting the resistance of the water and the numbing cold, turned simple cutting into a Herculean task. Sergei jammed the marline spike into a gap in the netting and pulled, trying to leverage the sheer mass of the hull. The spike bent slightly, but the net held fast, the tension now pulling the rudder blade sharply to one side. He changed tactics, relying on the knife. He focused the beam of the light, found a single, heavy strand near the shaft, and began to saw. The serrated edge caught, sawing through the synthetic fiber with a grating, unnatural sound that transmitted painfully through his skull. He sawed, pulled, regripped, and sawed again. The physical effort in the dense water was monumental, quickly depleting the precious air in his small scuba tank. His focus narrowed completely to the net. His mind was racing, not with fear, but with calculations. How many cuts? How much air? How long until a patrol boat finds the thermal signature of the hull? After what felt like an eternity, the first heavy strand snapped with a sharp, twanging sound. The tension lessened slightly. Sergei attacked the net with renewed, frantic energy, his body shaking from cold and exhaustion. He made deep cuts, slicing through the thick cords one by one, until his knife was dull and his forearm muscles screamed in protest. Finally, with a last, desperate tug, the bulk of the net gave way. It floated free of the propeller and the rudder, a tangled, ghostly shroud sinking slowly into the dark abyss. The propeller shaft was cleared. He checked the propeller. Miraculously, the blades appeared undamaged. The rudder, though, was jammed slightly to starboard, a dangerous orientation for restarting the engine. He pushed against the rudder fin with his boot, applying all his weight and leverage. The linkage resisted, then snapped back into a central, neutral position with a metallic clack of relief. His air was running low. The resistance of the regulator began to increase, demanding more effort for each shallow breath. He had maybe 2 minutes left before the tank was completely empty. Sergei immediately swam back to the open hatch, pulling himself into the oil-smelling, cramped cabin. He didn't bother to remove the mask or the heavy tank, instead focusing solely on securing the hatch. He fought the wingnuts back onto the bolts, the water still jetting fiercely into the cabin. He had to use all his strength to counter the external water pressure while simultaneously cranking the nuts down. Once the hatch was sealed, he collapsed onto the floorboards, pulling the depleted scuba rig off his back. The cabin was a mess. The brief, uncontrolled ingress of water had mixed with the spilled oil and diesel, creating a toxic, sloshing pool. His papers and navigation log, a handwritten series of compass bearings and time checks, were saturated, the ink blurring. He ignored the rising nausea and the shuddering cold and went straight for the engine. He pulled the starter cord. The diesel coughed, Once, twice, then turned over and sputtered to life. The whole hull vibrated with the raw energy of the restart, the small propeller churning the water outside. Sergei eased the Piranha back into motion, climbing slowly back up to his cruising depth of 10 meters. He felt the familiar, though slightly sluggish, resistance of the controls. He was moving. He was free of the net. He had lost precious time, nearly 2 hours, and was now running dangerously low on fuel, but he was still headed west. He checked the oil pressure gauge. It had dropped again, hovering just above the red failure zone. The engine was working on borrowed time. He knew he couldn't stop again. The next 12 hours would be an all-or-nothing race against the exhaustion of his mechanics and the exhaustion of his body. He was now operating on the very edge of survival, using sheer willpower to hold the entire, fragile contraption together. The edge of Swedish territorial waters was still roughly 90 kilometers away, and the sun would soon rise, bringing with it the threat of aerial surveillance. The first faint, steel-gray wash of dawn began to penetrate the deep water. Sergei, huddled over the controls, watched the viewport transform from absolute blackness to a murky, shifting gray-green. The light, usually a welcome sign of morning, was now his greatest enemy. With visibility, came detection. He was still submerged, maintaining his 10-meter depth, but the rising sun would give the Soviet patrols an immense advantage, especially from the air. He knew the routine of the Soviet Baltic Fleet aviation. As soon as the visibility reached a certain threshold, the Mi-14 Hayes anti-submarine helicopters and the slower Ilyushin Il-38 May maritime patrol aircraft would begin their grid search patterns. These aircraft were equipped with powerful magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD, and sophisticated radar capable of spotting even a periscope tip, or the subtle thermal signature of a small, warm hull moving in the cold water. Sergei fought the urge to surface, to breathe fresh air and orient himself visually. That was a luxury he couldn't afford. The diesel fumes inside the cabin were now so thick they were stinging his eyes and causing persistent, hacking coughs. He was running a dangerous high concentration of carbon monoxide. He had to rely on the snorkel, but the snorkel pipe sticking out of the water was the one thing that could give him away. He wrestled with the controls, sacrificing speed for discretion, trimming the ballast to keep the snorkel pipe's float valve barely bobbing on the surface. He dropped the engine down to the absolute lowest RPM he could maintain without stalling, moving the Piranha forward at a tedious 1.5 knots. Every minute felt like an hour. Then, he heard it, a distant, high-pitched womp-womp-womp that was not the rhythmic clatter of his own diesel. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy helicopter approaching rapidly from the east. Sergei reacted instantly, cutting his engine and flooding the trim tanks again. He needed to drop deep, fast. The whoosh of the water entering the tanks was alarmingly loud inside the silent cabin. The depth gauge passed 12 meters, then 13. The Piranha was descending into the gloom. He settled on 15 meters, the maximum depth he dared risk. The pressure stress on the hull was audible, a relentless, protesting symphony of creaks and groans. The helicopter was directly overhead. The sound was no longer distant, it was a physical hammer blow on the water, transmitted through the hull into his very bones. He could hear the faint, high-frequency chirp of its surface search radar sweeping the water above. He focused on his one remaining defensive tool, absolute silence and low thermal signature. He was essentially a cold piece of steel in a cold sea. If the helicopter dropped its sonobuoy, an acoustic listening device, or lowered its mad boom, he was finished. The massive magnetic influence of the boom alone would swing his primitive compass wildly and give away his location. The helicopter hovered, the rotors churning the surface directly above. For a full, agonizing 4 minutes, the acoustic presence remained stationary. It was searching, methodically, painstakingly. Perhaps they had picked up the slight wake turbulence from his snorkel pipe just before he submerged, or maybe they were simply performing a routine sweep of the exit channel. He felt a slight, sickening surge of water around the hull. The pressure difference caused by the massive downdraft from the rotors was unsettling the equilibrium of the Piranha. A few more drops of water, slightly faster now, began to seep from the damaged cooling line near the engine. Then, the womp-womp-womp began to move. Slowly at first, then gaining speed, the sound receded to the north. The pilot, satisfied that the contact was transient or insignificant, had moved on to the next segment of the grid. Sergei waited for 10 minutes, his body rigid, counting the seconds. Only when the helicopter's sound was utterly swallowed by the distance did he dare to act. He began the slow, painful process of blowing the ballast tanks with his compressed air cylinders. These cylinders were meant for buoyancy, but he was using the air to survive the depths. The air was finite. He rose slowly, cautiously. The sun was fully up now, and the water through the viewport was a brighter, more revealing blue. At 10 meters, he restarted the engine. The little diesel sputtered violently, protesting the cold and the brief, unplanned immersion, but it caught. He checked his calculations again. Distance to Swedish waters, now approximately 70 kilometers. At his reduced speed of 1.5 knots, he was looking at another 25 hours of travel, far longer than his engine and his body could possibly endure. He had to speed up. He pushed the throttle lever forward, ignoring the protesting whine of the engine and the terrifying dip in the oil pressure gauge. The Piranha surged forward to 2 knots, then 3. He was running the engine hot, risking total seizure, but it was the only way to beat the patrols and the clock. He had made it through the worst of the night, but the day promised constant, brutal exposure to Soviet surveillance. He knew he had to reach the relative safety of international shipping lanes quickly, hoping the heavy civilian traffic would provide him cover. The sun climbed higher, now beating down on the surface of the Baltic. Though the depth kept Sergei cold, the increased surface temperature meant the Soviet radar and thermal scanners were operating under optimal conditions. He forced himself to maintain the 10-meter cruising depth, the heat radiating off the stressed engine the only source of warmth inside the metallic tomb. The oil pressure gauge was now flickering intermittently in the red zone. The metallic squeal from the engine every time the boat pitched was no longer an inconvenience, it was a countdown. He knew the small diesel, scavenged from an old electrical generator, was hours past its endurance limit. But a more immediate, catastrophic crisis was unfolding in the stern: fuel starvation. He had estimated his fuel consumption based on the generator's stationary load, not the constant, high-stress demands of pushing a heavy, homemade submarine through rough water. The 3 jerrycans he had crammed into the aft ballast section, feeding the engine through a hand-pumped line, were nearly empty. He could hear the pump sucking air with a high-pitched, desperate hiss. He cut the throttle, letting the Piranha drift for a moment while he performed the desperate, manual task of switching fuel lines. He wrestled with the heavy, brittle plastic hoses in the confined space, the diesel fumes now so overwhelming he was starting to gag. He managed to connect the feed line to the final, precious can. When he restarted the engine, it caught on the first pull, a burst of energy that belied its imminent failure. He glanced at his handwritten log: 60 kilometers to Swedish waters. He now had less than 4 hours of estimated fuel remaining. At his current speed of 3 knots, he needed over 10 hours. The calculation was terrifyingly simple. He would run out of fuel long before he reached safety. He had 2 choices: keep running at full speed and hope a miracle occurred, that the Swedish Coast Guard happened upon him early, or surface, try to find a sail or a paddle, and pray he wasn't spotted by a Soviet vessel. Surfacing was surrender. He pushed the throttle to maximum. The engine screamed, the entire hull vibrating with a fierce, punishing shudder. The Piranha was now moving at its absolute theoretical limit, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 knots. He watched the compass needle, focusing every ounce of willpower on holding the course. The next hour was a blur of noise, cold, and intense physical discomfort. He was starving, dehydrated, and suffering from acute sleep deprivation. Hallucinations began to creep into the edges of his vision. He saw flashes of light outside the viewport, convinced a Soviet patrol had dropped a flare. Then, a new sound cut through the drone of his engine, a massive, deep thrum that seemed to originate from the core of the ocean. It was not a military propeller cavitation. It was the sound of a supertanker or a massive cargo freighter, a ship so large it displaced the water around it with the power of a natural phenomenon. He had reached the international shipping lanes. Sergei knew he had to take advantage of this cover. The massive, deep-draft vessels would create immense acoustic clutter and thermal interference, making his small, primitive sub virtually undetectable by long-range sensors. He steered toward the noise, increasing his depth slightly to 12 meters to ensure he passed well below the keel of the massive ship. He didn't dare surface to look, but the sound was overwhelming, moving directly west. The vast hull of the freighter passed directly over the Piranha. The water turbulence was violent, throwing the tiny sub sideways and rocking it viciously. Inside, loose equipment clattered, and the oil lamp swung wildly. Sergei fought the controls, wrestling the rudder and the hydroplanes to keep the Piranha from tumbling out of control. For a minute, he was caught in the wake, spinning slowly, utterly at the mercy of the enormous power of the international commerce passing overhead. When the turbulence subsided, the freighter's massive engine sound began to recede. But the passage of the first ship was followed by the sound of others, a constant parade of commercial traffic. He had found his invisible highway. He now had a new problem. His engine began to sputter violently, missing cycles. The flow of fuel was inconsistent. He was not just running low, he was running out. The fuel line was sucking air, the engine fighting the last drops of diesel. With a final, desperate clang and a dying whine, the 8-horsepower diesel engine seized. The propeller stopped turning. The vessel immediately lost forward momentum and began to drift, silent, cold, and utterly dead in the water, only 25 kilometers from safety. The silence after the engine's catastrophic failure was not peaceful, it was a profound, suffocating void. The deep thrumming of the international shipping traffic continued far above, an indifferent, ongoing rumble that only emphasized Sergei's sudden, total helplessness. He was adrift in a cold, metal coffin, a silent ghost in the busiest stretch of the Baltic Sea, 25 kilometers from freedom, a distance he now had no power to cross. He hammered his fist, weakly, against the engine casing. It was hot, smelling sharply of burnt oil and metal. The engine was dead. Completely. The severe stress and lack of lubrication had caused the final, irreversible seizure. All that was left was the sloshing of the oil-water mix on the floorboards and the sound of his own desperate, ragged breathing. Sergei fought off the paralyzing cold and the onset of acute despair. He was a mechanic, his instinct was to fix. He unbolted the inspection plate on the engine housing, exposing the damaged block. In the dim light of the oil lamp, he saw the irreparable damage, a crack, hairline but definitive, across the crankcase. He had run it to death. There was no repair possible at sea, not in this cramped, submerged prison. He reviewed his options, listing them mentally in Russian, his fingers sketching the possibilities on the condensation-streaked wall of the hull. Wait, remain submerged and drift, hoping the current would carry him into Swedish waters before Soviet patrols noticed a derelict hull in the middle of the shipping lane. Risk, extreme. The drift was slow and unpredictable. Fuel was gone. Air was toxic. Surface and signal, emerge now, in international waters, and use his single flare gun to signal one of the massive freighters. Risk, immediate and overwhelming. Soviet patrols were still conducting sweeps. The first vessel to find him might be wearing the hammer and sickle. Manual propulsion, attempt to rig the hand pump for the carbon dioxide scrubber as a crude pump for propulsion, or somehow turn the propeller shaft by hand. Risk, exhaustion and slow death. Physically impossible to move 2.5 tons of steel any meaningful distance against the current. He chose a combination of the first and the second, prioritizing stealth. He would maintain his depth and wait for the natural current to push him west. But he had to improve the air quality. He went back to the CO2 scrubber, cranking the handle with a grim, punishing determination. He worked until his arms burned, recycling the stale air over the powdered lime, trying to clear the sickening fog of carbon monoxide that was dulling his senses. The hours that followed were the most brutal of the entire voyage. The sun rose to its zenith and began its descent, marking time with agonizing slowness. Sergei's position was defined by nothing more than the slight, rocking motion of the hull and the subtle, slow swing of the magnetic compass. He was now relying entirely on the whim of the deepwater currents. He was still cold, but the exhaustion was now so profound that he began to shiver less. This was not relief, it was the dangerous quiet of late-stage hypothermia. He forced himself to move, drinking the last half-cup of his precious water, chewing the last hard, flavorless piece of his bread. He focused on the only thing left, the compass needle. He had drifted for 6 hours. He recalculated the distance. He was now approximately 15 kilometers from the Swedish boundary line. At the current rate of drift, less than half a knot, he would require another 18 to 24 hours to cross the line. He did not have that kind of time. He was out of food, out of water, and running critically low on his secondary air supply. He made the decision, he had to surface. It was late afternoon, approximately 1,700 hours. The international shipping traffic had thinned slightly. The Soviet aerial patrols would have shifted to surface vessels for the evening watch. It was his best and last window. Sergei wrestled with the ballast controls, opening the valves that released his compressed air into the tanks, forcibly expelling the heavy seawater. The pressure in his reserve air cylinders was low, and the rise was agonizingly slow. The Piranha, dead weight in the water, fought the buoyancy. At 5 meters, the light through the viewport was blinding, a brilliant, terrifying blue-white. He could see the waves, choppy and agitated. At 2 meters, he saw a dark shape flash past the viewport, fast and deep, a large, powerful patrol boat. It was too quick to identify, but its silhouette screamed military. He froze the ascent, cutting the air supply, letting the sub settle back to 3 meters. He was still too close to the surface, and the danger was immediate. He waited 10 minutes, heart pounding, listening for the telltale sonar ping or the returning roar of the engines. Nothing. It was a close pass, a terrifying brush with his fate. He resumed the ascent. Finally, with a slight, sickening surge, the Piranha broke the surface. The sound of the open air was a deafening relief after the hours of internal noise. Sergei fumbled with the hatch wing nuts, his fingers numb. He pushed the heavy plate open and emerged, gasping, into the sunlight. He was battered, disoriented, and soaked, but he was out. The tiny, battered hull bobbed precariously on the rough surface of the Baltic. He raised his binoculars, a final scavenged piece of equipment, and scanned the horizon. To the east, nothing but the endless sea. To the west, a faint, dark line on the horizon, land. It was the island of Gotland, Swedish territory. Freedom. But his relief was short-lived. To his south, gaining speed and kicking up a heavy white wake, was a vessel of unmistakable, menacing design, a Project 205, OSA class, missile boat of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. It was fast, heavily armed, and its primary mission was to patrol this very boundary. He had been spotted. The OSA-class missile boat was a lethal, low-slung predator, designed for lightning-fast coastal attack. Its 4 heavy SS-N, 2 Styx anti-ship missiles were not designed for a man in a homemade submarine, but the vessel's accompanying armament, a twin-barreled 30mm gun and its sheer speed, was more than enough to end Sergei's dream instantly. The boat was already angled toward him, its radar dish spinning rapidly, confirming the tiny, bobbing anomaly on the surface. Sergei, still half out of the hatch, didn't hesitate. The engine was dead, but the piranha was floating, and he had his secret weapon, the sail. In the cabin, he had stored 2 sections of aluminum pipe and a heavy piece of canvas tarp, a crude mast and sail, designed for exactly this final, impossible scenario. He was too exhausted, too cold, and too exposed to waste time. He slammed the hatch shut, not bothering to seal it completely, and scrambled onto the slick, narrow deck of the sub. The wind on the open Baltic was fierce. He fought to raise the mast section, his muscles screaming against the simple, physical task. He jammed the base into a reinforced socket he had welded onto the forward deck and used a single rope stay to lash it roughly into place. The canvas, heavy and unwieldy, caught the wind immediately, pulling at his numb fingers. The missile boat was now less than 5 kilometers away, a dark gray blur closing the distance at an alarming speed. Through the binoculars, he could make out the sharp bow wave and the figures of Soviet sailors moving on the bridge, likely preparing for interception. He was sailing a 2.5-ton cylinder with a sail the size of a picnic blanket. It was an absurdity. But the wind, thankfully, was a strong westerly gust, pushing him precisely toward the promised land of Gotland. The tiny sail caught the wind, and with a jarring lurch, the piranha began to move. It wasn't fast, maybe 1.5 knots, but it was movement, it was direction, and it was bought with air he could no longer afford to use to blow ballast. The Soviet boat was closing fast. They were already well within range of the 30mm gun. Sergei could almost feel the cold, bureaucratic anger of the Project 205's commander, a man whose career depended on not allowing a single, bizarre defection to slip through his watch. He focused on steering the unmanageable craft. The piranha was designed for subsurface stability, not surface sailing. It listed dangerously, threatening to capsize with every swell. He used the large hydroplanes as crude, submerged rudders, manually operating the bicycle chain linkages inside the hull using a set of long, makeshift poles he had prepared. For kilometers. The boat was now recognizable, its name in white Russian letters on the hull clearly visible, R-249. Suddenly, a massive, booming roar split the air. Not gunfire, but a terrifying blast of the missile boat's horn, a sound designed to stop any vessel instantly. The air warbled with the vibration. Sergei ignored it, clinging to the mast, his eyes locked on the distant, dark smudge of Gotland. The missile boat slowed slightly, pulling alongside, maintaining a distance of about 500 meters. They were close enough for the crew to see the pathetic, homemade nature of his escape vessel, the rusty, curved boiler tubes, the exposed welds, the flapping canvas sail. A voice, amplified by a powerful loudhailer, cut across the wind, booming an order in Russian: "Stop your vessel immediately. Prepare to be boarded. Any attempt to proceed will be met with force." Sergei, his lips cracked and dry, merely tightened his grip on the rigging. He was close enough now that he could see the border guard markings on the Soviet vessel's hull, the green stripe of the KGB's maritime frontier forces. Then, from the extreme edge of the horizon to the west, a new shape appeared. This vessel was sleeker, smaller, and painted in bright white and orange, a Swedish Coast Guard patrol vessel, likely summoned by the commotion or by the radar signature of the aggressively maneuvering Soviet missile boat. The neutral lifeline had arrived. The sudden appearance of the Swedish Coast Guard vessel, a KBV 300 series patrol boat known for its high speed and maneuverability, changed the dynamic instantly. The Soviet OSA-class missile boat, R-249, could not simply open fire or board a civilian vessel within sight of a neutral nation's enforcement arm without triggering an international incident. The Cold War Baltic was a tinderbox of sensitive maritime boundaries, and even a rogue defector didn't warrant a diplomatic crisis. The R-249's commander now faced a time-critical dilemma: intercept and secure the defector before he reached the internationally recognized 12 nautical mile limit of Swedish territorial waters, or back off and watch the escape succeed. The Soviet vessel immediately increased speed again, no longer maneuvering defensively, but entering into a full-throttle pursuit. They were trying to cut off Sergei's meager sailing trajectory. The powerful loudhailer roared again, the voice now tinged with genuine fury: "Soviet citizen. You are ordered to abandon your vessel and prepare for rescue by the Soviet Navy. This is your final warning." The wake from the rapidly accelerating R-249 hit the tiny Piranha like a rogue wave. Sergei, clinging to the mast, was drenched in frigid salt spray. The little sub, never designed for such surface abuse, listed sharply. The half-closed hatch cover slammed against the hull with a deafening clang, and a significant amount of seawater sloshed into the already flooded cabin. Sergei knew he couldn't control the sub effectively with water sloshing beneath him, threatening to destabilize the center of gravity and capsize the vessel. He had to trust the sheer momentum of the wind. He looked back at the Swedish vessel. The white and orange patrol boat was now moving fast, a clean, high-speed line cutting straight toward the chaotic scene. They were closing the distance, but the R-249 was closer to the sub. It was a three-way race to the invisible line in the water. Sergei was running on pure adrenaline and deep, bone-set fear. He could feel the Piranha shuddering, the canvas sail flapping violently, the rigging protesting under the strain. He knew the Soviet sailors would have likely spotted the makeshift scuba tank and the loose wires near the open hatch, confirming this was not a derelict vessel but a desperate act of defection. The missile boat pulled within 200 meters, paralleling his course. He could clearly see the faces of the crew on the deck, some pointing, others standing ready near the rail. He saw one officer raise a signal pistol, not a weapon of lethal force, but a clear sign of intent to board and subdue. The Soviet commander's tactic was now clear: use the massive bow wave of the R-249 to flip the tiny sub, forcing Sergei into the water where he could be easily plucked out and returned to Soviet jurisdiction. The R-249 veered hard to starboard, its powerful diesel engines roaring, creating a towering wall of white water. The wash slammed into the Piranha's port side. The homemade sub was thrown violently sideways, the mast dipping dangerously close to the water. Sergei lost his footing, his grip tearing from the cold steel. He slid across the slick hull, miraculously catching the edge of the open hatch, his body halfway in and halfway out of the dark, oil-filled cabin. The sub was seconds from capsizing. Just as the Piranha righted itself, staggering through the chop, the Swedish vessel intervened. The KBV-300 cut its powerful engines, simultaneously deploying its small, rigid-hulled inflatable boat, RHIB, and activating a blinding searchlight directly onto the scene. Crucially, the Swedish vessel placed itself physically between the Soviet missile boat and the defector, a bold, non-verbal declaration of interest. A calm, professional voice, this time speaking in flawless, clear English, cut across the wind from the Swedish Coast Guard: "This is Swedish territorial waters. Cease pursuit immediately. The vessel is under observation." Sergei, now able to stand again, looked past the Swedish boat. He checked his compass. The line was no longer an abstraction. The boundary was marked by an invisible, precise longitude line. He estimated he had crossed the line during the violent lurch caused by the Soviet wake. The R-249 maintained its course for a tense 20 seconds, the commander clearly debating a final, aggressive push. Then, the inevitable order was given. The Soviet missile boat throttled back, its powerful engine settling into an angry, resentful idle. The boat turned slowly, its high, proud flag of the Soviet Navy retreating toward the east. The escape was technically complete. The powerful surge of the Soviet vessel's retreat caused the Piranha to rock violently one last time, but the danger had passed. Sergei, exhausted and trembling from the combination of cold, dehydration, and adrenaline, watched the R-249 diminish into a dark spot on the horizon. He was safe. The silent, invisible 12 nautical mile line had done what his dead engine and meager sail could not: protect him from the might of the Soviet state. The Swedish Coast Guard KBV-300 approached cautiously, the professional efficiency of its crew a stark contrast to the aggressive maneuvers of the Soviet warship. The RHIB, already deployed, sped toward the bobbing, absurd spectacle of the homemade submarine. As the RHIB pulled alongside, a young Swedish Coast Guard officer, clad in bright orange survival gear, looked down at Sergei, his expression a mixture of profound shock and professional concern. "Välkommen till Sverige," the officer called out, his voice clear and calm above the choppy water. "Welcome to Sweden." Are you injured? We need to get you out of that vessel immediately. Sergei could barely speak. His voice was a dry, raw croak. He lifted a hand, pointing weakly toward the piranha's hull. He managed only 2 words, the culmination of his entire 3-day ordeal: asylum. Submarine. Asylum. Submarine. The Swedish crew was meticulous. They understood immediately the significance of the man and his vessel. Their first priority was Sergei's medical condition. They lifted him carefully from the greasy, cramped deck and onto the RHIB, wrapping him in thick, thermal blankets. The intense cold that had been his constant companion now gave way to the painful, fiery sensation of rewarming. As the RHIB sped back to the main patrol vessel, Sergei looked back at his creation. The piranha, listing heavily and half-submerged due to the seawater sloshing inside, looked like a defeated, exhausted beast of metal. It was a bizarre monument to personal desperation, floating in the choppy waters of freedom. A team of Swedish technicians boarded the submarine to secure it and check for any potential explosive devices or sensitive instrumentation. What they found inside was a testament to Sergei's mechanical genius and poverty of resources: the fused diesel block, the hand-cranked CO2 scrubber, the collection of scavenged parts, and the oil-soaked copy of Konstantin Postovsky's The Story of the Woods. The only evidence of his journey was the crude map, the blurred log, and the overwhelming scent of diesel, salt, and stale air. The KBV-300 took the piranha in tow, carefully navigating toward the naval base at Visby on Gotland Island. The journey was slow, attracting immediate attention. News of the homemade Soviet submarine that successfully breached the heavily guarded Baltic maritime frontier spread through the global naval community like wildfire. Sergei was taken ashore and immediately transferred to a secure facility. The Swedish authorities, following strict neutrality protocols, began the process of confirming his identity and verifying his request for political asylum. His story, the construction of the sub from salvaged boiler tubes and generator parts, the silent, 3-day journey under the noses of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, was meticulously recorded. The Soviet ambassador in Stockholm issued a swift and furious protest, demanding the immediate return of Sergei and the stolen state property, the piranha. They claimed Sergei was a disgruntled worker who had appropriated shipyard materials, not a defector seeking freedom. The Swedes, however, treated the case as a clear example of a citizen escaping political repression. Sergei was granted provisional asylum. He was safe. He had physically broken through the Iron Curtain, not through diplomacy or smuggling, but through sheer mechanical ingenuity and stubborn will. The piranha was hauled out of the water at Visby, drawing a crowd of shocked military analysts, naval historians, and journalists. The fact that this crude, jury-rigged contraption had slipped past the most expensive, sophisticated radar and sonar nets the Soviet Union possessed was an immense embarrassment to the Kremlin and a minor diplomatic victory for the West. Sergei's name became whispered evidence of the Soviet system's decay. The mighty, paranoid security apparatus of the USSR had been defeated by a mechanic, a welder, and a few old boiler tubes. He had achieved the impossible. The international media descended on Gotland, hungry for the details of the mechanic's impossible voyage. Sergei, however, remained sequestered by the Swedish authorities, undergoing debriefing. The information he provided about the Soviet naval routines, particularly the blind spots in the P-3 radar net and the operational limitations of the border guard patrols, was of immense strategic interest to Western intelligence, though the defection itself was ultimately a human story, not a geopolitical plot. The piranha became an immediate cultural and political artifact. Swedish naval intelligence conducted a thorough examination of the craft. They confirmed its construction: 3 salvaged boiler tubes, a tiny 8-horsepower generator diesel engine, ballast tanks made from oxygen cylinders, and a rudimentary set of hydroplanes controlled by bicycle chain and cables. The sheer, terrifying simplicity of the design baffled experts. It was too small to consistently register as a submarine, often appearing on sonar as simple thermal noise or acoustic clutter, a piece of forgotten junk, not a manned vessel. The Soviet guards were shocked, not by their failure to detect a stealth submarine, but by their failure to detect the impossibility of a civilian crossing. The diplomatic fallout was sharp but contained. The Soviet Union continued to demand Sergei's return, labeling him a criminal and a thief. Sweden refused, upholding the fundamental principle of asylum. The incident, however, served as a quiet, undeniable symbol of the systemic failure of Soviet border control in the late Cold War era. It highlighted the vast resources poured into defense against high-tech NATO intrusions, while a desperate individual could exploit the system's focus on macro threats. For Sergei, the immediate aftermath was a long process of recovery and adaptation. His first days in Sweden were spent under medical supervision, recovering from acute exposure, malnutrition, and the psychological strain of continuous submerged terror. He was not a spy, not a political dissident in the formal sense, but simply a man who yearned for a life outside the confines of the Soviet state. His story resonated deeply in the West. He was not only granted permanent political asylum but was also offered opportunities to restart his life. He chose anonymity and peace over the inevitable circus of fame. He was settled in a quiet part of Sweden, far from the media glare, finally free to pursue his passion for mechanics without the suffocating limitations of the Soviet system. The Piranha, his vessel of escape, was eventually transferred to a private collection, cementing its status as a bizarre historical footnote. It was a tangible piece of the late Cold War narrative, a physical demonstration that the will of a single, determined individual could overcome the most powerful, centralized security state in the world. The long-term impact of Sergei's escape was subtle but significant. It contributed to the narrative of the Soviet Union's increasing vulnerability and decay during the Gorbachev era of glasnost and perestroika. It was a powerful, if ridiculous, image, the massive, grey fleet of the Baltic Navy rendered impotent by a hand-welded boiler. Ultimately, Sergei's journey was a testament to the universal human impulse for freedom. He had survived the mechanical breakdown, the threat of detection, the violent pursuit, and the crippling cold. He had traded a life of predictability and repression for an unknown future built on the sheer, terrifying hope that steel and will could conquer the sea. In the end, the Soviet guards were shocked because they were trained to look for an enemy outside their system, not a desperate man trying to escape from within it. Sergei, the mechanic, proved that the most sophisticated security apparatus can be defeated not by technology, but by a homemade submarine and the desire for freedom, a desire as fundamental and unstoppable as the ocean current that finally delivered him to the shore.